All right. We are now live for another political theory and practice discussion. I've been bouncing this one from weekend to weekend to weekend, in part because I was hoping that our situation here in the United States would be more or less resolved and we're ready to start moving ahead. And that does not entirely seem to be the case. But, I wanted to get this in before Christmas. So, I don't have any notes prepared, but I've been thinking a lot about these topics that I want to discuss. I see we've got some good questions already on the side, so I might not go quite as long in the initial discussion part. So, we're now a month and a half roughly from one of our most contentious and indeed, from a very hyper-partisan perspective, contested elections. We are still seeing on the Republican side, among some people at least, the Trump and his administration, and quite a few other Republicans who publicly hitched their wagon to that star of the lawsuits. Claims that the election was not a legitimate one in one way or another, that voter fraud took place, all this sort of stuff. And so, we have not had an orderly succession. We have instead had a contestation and, in effect, attempts to turn various workings of democracy here in the United States. It's, people looking at this from the outside, I think a lot of Americans, particularly those on the right, are not realizing how crazy and how problematic this becomes. And I will say one other thing, too, about this beforehand. I think a lot of Americans, this is a bit of a tangent, assume that not only are we the center of the universe, but also that, things have to be there has to be sort of like a continuation of America as having the prestige and power that we currently have. And this is a version of American exceptionalism that you can find on both sides of the political aisle, and a lot in the center as well. And there's just nothing to say, when you look at world history, there's nothing to say that any one particular culture, civilization, nation state will outlast its internal problematics and the things that are bringing it under, particularly when it's facing pressure and rivalry from other great powers that are aiming at hegemony. And we're in a bad. So I'm going to say this: we're in a bad state here in the United States, and it's been going on for a long time. COVID-19 has been totally mishandled, particularly at the federal level, but also at many states levels and in many institutions as well. And COVID-19 just, in many respects, revealed the many cracks running through the substructure of American society. Things that we're going to have to deal with, things that we're going to have some sort of coming together, or pushing some voices to the fringe and achieving a consensus, or we're screwed. And that's the bottom line for that sort of stuff. That's my view. We're going to talk about some political theory that I think helps to illuminate that in just a bit, particularly Aristotle and Thomas Hobbes. But going back to the election itself, I think it's a very bad sign for us that not only the election was so contested and so close, even with a lot of efforts at keeping people from being able to vote and things like that going on. I think that it's a bad sign as well that we keep ratcheting up the partisanship. Part of having a functional democracy is saying, okay, we lost, now move on. And granted, the Trump people can say, well, the Hillary people didn't do that. They were shouting, not my president. Well, the Trump people, pretty much all of them are people who, well, actually, no, quite a few of them did vote for Obama. When Obama won, there was that shedding in important states like here in Wisconsin. But quite a few of them are people who were like saying Obama wasn't their president either. And then, we go back and there were a lot of people who were saying George Bush wasn't their president, in part because of the, constitutional crisis, we could say, that almost emerged out of 2000. So we've got like 20 years now of this hyper partisan, tear it all down, fight, take power at any cost. And it hasn't just been the Republicans doing that. Over that 20-year period. And you can observe this not just within our electoral politics, but also in what's been happening within our legislatures. So a lot of problematic stuff going on. And if we want to see the sorts of things that as Americans we're going to need going forward to be a functional, democratic rule of law society, you're going to need a lot of reconstruction. And I think I'm not very optimistic about that on a national level. I'm going to, myself, here's where the practice comes in. Even if we're pessimistic about that sort of stuff, we still throw ourselves into things. I mean, I'm going to be, once we've actually got a succession, one of the things I'm going to be pushing for is Medicare for all, and trying as best as I can as a private citizen to hold the Biden people to the fire about that. And that's the sort of thing that you can do. And you can be involved in your local politics. Our Milwaukee City Council stuff is kind of a hot mess to watch, but it's worth checking in on. There's a lot of things that we can do. So one of the things that I did want to talk about before we get into talking about like Aristotle and Hobbes is so Biden. I think we can take it for granted that unless there is some sort of coup, Biden is going to be, the president. We're going to have a Biden administration. He's already got cabinet members lined up. And surprise, surprise, a lot of these cabinet members are former deputy director of this or that cabinet under the Obama administration. It looks very much like a Obama, 2.0 kind of administration. And it's very important to remember, too, that the president in the United States, with the exception of outliers like Donald Trump, the presidency is usually not just the president kind of going it alone. It's all the people who they pick to run things, the cabinet, right? That's very important. And so if we want to see what the Biden administration's commitments are, then we look at who they put in as, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of State, all these different important positions. And, for the most part, it does look like a pretty centrist regime that's going to be coming in, which means that they're not very interested in the things that the leftist Democrats, I think quite rightly, as myself, an independent, I think that they're on the right point with that, with saying we need to do something about, more fair tax burdens, which means taxing the rich more, closing loopholes, providing some sort of universal health care, a number of different things. I think the Biden administration is going to have to be really, really pushed on a lot of those things. And when you do that, then there's this tendency to say, oh, but then you're like playing into the hands of the right. And, if you criticize them, this is what went on during the Obama years, right? If you're criticizing from further left and saying these are the positions you should have, then you're giving ammunition to the opposition. And that is a big problem. I think that we need to figure out a way to see our way past that. There's also this big thing going on within the I'm seeing some stupid comments here, so I'm going to do a little bit of hiding some of these. So I'm seeing a lot of calls for, including from the Biden administration, unity, and it strikes me that right now, I understand why there's a rhetorical appeal for that, but that strikes me as kind of a stupid way to go about things. It's very clear, looking back, say a decade or so, that the Republicans are going to do the same thing as they did during the Obama administration and try to like hold stuff up as much as possible and get in as many, shots against the administration to try to delegitimize it. and prepare for a run in 2024. And so I don't think that there really should be a lot of compromise. I think the Democrats should play hardball as much as possible. The question is whether they're going to play hardball for stuff that's genuinely for the people, or whether they're going to play hardball more for their own interests or their own conception of that. But I don't think that there should be any let's try to understand the Trump, voter. That we've already done 4 years of that, and a lot of it is not a desire to be understood on their part, the Trump, people. It's more a desire to dominate and control and to win by any means necessary. And I think with people like that, there's really not that much that you can do. So let's talk very briefly about some of the before I take some of these questions, some of the issues that I think are really worth thinking about here. So, Aristotle's Politics should be recommended reading, as should Hobbes' Leviathan. And when you read Hobbes' Leviathan correctly, instead of in a sort of a hysteric kind of, oh, we don't want totalitarianism, we don't want the sovereign to be in place kind of mode, and you look carefully at what he's actually saying, Hobbes is very worried, and rightly so, because he lived through an English Civil War, about the ways in which different factions can use the language of political theory and theology and all these other things to essentially try to grab power for themselves in such a way that plays into a dynamic that then destabilizes matters. And I've written on this, not so much with American politics, but with other politics. You could easily Google the stuff I've written on Hobbes. And I'm convinced that Hobbes' worry about the state of nature is really more of a rhetorical construct. What he's really concerned about is a not so healthy commonwealth breaking down because of all these rivalries and factions that are able to, co-opt certain, let's call them dimensions of society, right? And so his response to that is, well, you need a powerful sovereign to control that and to break any sort of private associations like that, and then to have a monopoly on power. I'm not advocating that, but I think that Hobbes rightly identifies the problematic that we've been sliding into for quite a while here in America. Aristotle is also somebody who people should read, and if you want to understand how things go wrong, look at book 5 of the Politics, which is about what he calls stasis, which we could translate as faction or societal breakdown. A lot of the dimensions that he's talking about, including passional dimensions, anger, hatred, envy, all these sorts of things, play a role in it. Grievances that have not been properly addressed, that people are exploiting, those play a role in societal breakdown. Now, I'm not saying we're like like a step away from that or anything like that. I mean, there are people who think, oh, we're like one step away from civil war. I think we could come back from the brink, but it's not going to happen with anything that's being offered on the right, and I don't see much being offered by the current position of the the Biden administration. I don't see an awful lot that's going to be productive. I see them being a little bit too idealistic about this sort of thing. So I'm really interested to see how they're going to govern and where they can be steered towards following through on things that are traditionally. Some of these are traditionally like nowadays Democrat issues, but they're also conservative issues, like not screwing up the environment. That used to actually be a conservative thing. The conservatives today are not really that conservative because they haven't conserved conservatism, you could say, in some of its respects. I mean, it's good to keep in mind these are coalitions. All right, let's take a look at some of these questions that are arising. Zach says, how do you deal with incredibly racist parents in general? Trying to explain why Trump is racist never goes well, since they just call me a liberal. how do we move forward with thoughts like these? So there's a lot of people in these sorts of quandaries, I would say. And I don't think that you're really going to make much progress in trying to discuss things with people whose minds are already not just closed in a static way, but who are constantly being fed garbage by the social media, the traditional media, that they are imbibing narratives that are very sophisticatedly put out there. I don't think it's, this is not the 1960s where if you had a John Bircher in your family, you could like essentially cult deprogram them. It's a lot tougher. And so much of it is also tied in with like geography and demographics. If you here in Milwaukee, if you drive into Waukesha County, you will see significant differences in the way that people are behaving, in what they're saying, what they're doing. And that's just one county over. And that's an urbanized county for the most part, but it's the Republican capital of this state of Wisconsin. And it ties in with things like masking and social distancing, because that has become a politicized issue. It shouldn't have become, but it has, unfortunately, as will vaccinations, right? And so I think with people like that, what you can do is if you want to retain connections with them, you can try to not talk politics, and that probably means, opting out of some conversations and not spending that much time with them, and you also want to start looking for other people who you can have productive conversations with. It's sad, but there's a lot of cases of family members, and I've got many family members who are Trump supporters, because my family, a good portion of it is pretty redneck, the kind of rednecks that know the difference between rednecks and hillbillies, and some of them are union, but a lot of union people are now pro-Trump, depending on what kind of union they're in. So iron workers, great example of that. A lot of them are Trumpers. What do you do? Well, you can talk about some things with them, but other things not. I mean, I've got an aunt who is a registered nurse and doesn't wear a mask. That's how deep this rot has gotten. And so, I think what you have to do is on the one hand, think about what you're going to do in relation to the people who matter to you, who are essentially locked into their position, and then think about what you're going to do to develop your own emotional connection and support network to sustain yourself. So Kuftika asks a general question: how should I begin learning political theory and studying influential thinkers in the subject? I mean, there's no one single way. You could start in a chronological way with reading Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle and other thinkers throughout the ancient period. You could also expand it to reading important non-Western thinkers like Kautila and I mean, everybody loves Sun Tzu, but I think Sun Tzu is probably a little bit elevated too high in the rankings of things. There's plenty of other theorists you can read in Chinese philosophy as well. But I mean, you can read all sorts of things, or you can jump to the present and read your way backwards almost. Like you could pick up Hannah Arendt's. I mean, if you want a work that you're going to have to work at, Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which got sold, as like a bestseller once Trump came to power. It's a tough book, but if you actually read it through and then you follow up on some of the footnotes, you are going to get a pretty good grounding. So you could think of it as sort of a lifelong process, and there's all sorts of Zach gives a recommendation here. There's all sorts of like survey texts that will give you like, here's what this theory is, here's what this theory is, here's what this theory is. Those are nothing wrong with those. Just realize they're always written from a perspective. So they're probably skewed one way or the other. Wolf Wood asks a question that he thinks is tangential, but I think is actually quite an interesting one. Given my academic background, how do I see all the fuss regarding Jill Biden's doctorate? I think that it's pretty clear to me that the fuss, you could say, is coming entirely from the right or from centrists who are just kind of assholes, basically. Like the guy who wrote the Wall Street Journal piece, I think is just a prime example of an asshole. You know, you look at the other stuff that he's written. I mean, the idea that medical doctors are the only people who should be called doctors is so ahistorical and silly as to not be worth taking seriously. I mean, when did they first start getting called medical doctors? Pretty recently, right? Whereas doctus, somebody who can teach, that goes back to the Middle Ages. Right? The early universities, by the way, had three main degrees, that were terminal degrees. One was medicine, one was law, one was theology, and all of them required that you study philosophy and the liberal arts on the way. You wouldn't get to just like specialize in medicine, and so it's kind of silly, and it's frankly it's clearly sexist and it's clearly classist. I think you could spend time unpacking an argument why that's the case, but for me, it's almost like just right in your face. Nobody quibbles about me calling myself, Dr. Sadler or anything like that. Now it's funny because there are a lot of people out there who do think, oh, well, if you're teaching at Harvard or University of Chicago, that must be so much harder and require so much more, brain work than teaching at a community college. No, that's totally classist assumptions based in unreality. The people at Harvard or University of Chicago are not any smarter than any other place. I've dealt with a lot of them. Talent is about evenly distributed. It's really about class dynamics. And if you want to teach and you want to do hard work, teach in a 4-year program, teach in a 2-year program, because it's easy to teach Harvard kids. They come in, they're all prepped to learn and stuff like that. Plus your teaching load is super easy, right? Teaching in prisons and community colleges and small 4-year liberal arts colleges, in adult education programs and stuff like that, that's where the real hard teaching takes place. And so, that's something to keep in mind, I would say. Michael writes, hard to find high-level relevance like this. Well, I hope it's all relevant. Thanks. That's a nice compliment. Let's see what the next one is. Rahim, would you recommend Francis Fukuyama's works, Origins of Political Order and Its Decay? I haven't read that one. So Fukuyama is somebody I'm hoping this current year to get back to. He made a big splash with End of History and The Last Man, which I still think is actually quite good in some respects. And I might do some videos on that. And I think the last book I read by him is Our Posthuman Future, which was quite good. But that's dating it a good way. So I'm not really a great Fukuyama person, right? All right, R.T. Whitby. Hume said that philosophy was not for the many, but for the approbation of the wise. What do you think of this kind of intellectual elitism that existed in the past and still exists in philosophy? I would say that that's partly representative of Hume and partly not representative of Hume. I wouldn't take one quip as like the summary of his work. There's a lot of work on Hume, not so much in political philosophy, but in moral philosophy that was done in the 20th century. Philosophy can be elitist. There are some things where philosophy probably ought to be elitist. We don't take a vote on how to interpret, Hume's treatise or Heidegger's Being and Time or pick whatever you want. That would be ridiculous. But we should say that here's my take on this. So philosophy is elitist in that there is a class system to it, an arbitrary one. And the problem with class systems is not class systems as such. It's that the distinctions often are not correlated to anything that really ought to matter. So like, when we engage in, racism, right? It's skin color and stuff like that is usually irrelevant to the moral decisions that we need to make. And so it's stupid to do that. It's irrational, and it's in some respect anti-human in the sense that it goes against what's available in our human nature and we should develop. And in philosophy, there's been an awful lot of that. Much of it is quite arbitrary, but I think what we do is we figure out how practically we're going to undo that. So a great example of this is there's a lot of contestations about canon. What should we be teaching? And when I'm setting up my classes, I do think about like, who do I want to bring in that hasn't been taught before, or who doesn't typically get taught. So I've been teaching Mary Wollstonecraft for years and years. You're still, if you look at like histories of moral philosophy, they mostly don't even recognize her, or Marge Cavendish, or Estelle, or any of these people. You got to like wait until the 20th century, and then they might talk about de Beauvoir and Arendt, or they might not. So bringing in theorists. When it comes to like good, solid historical and practical work on the people that I'm really interested in, like Aristotle or the Stoics, I would say that at least half of the research is being done by women today. So you make sure that you signal, Gisela Stryker's work or Julia Anas's work, and so that you can do practical things like that, and I think that's helpful. And also you talk about issues across the spectrum, right? All right. Michael Leffman has got a Zizek question. What do I think about Zizek's worry about the left's ability to organize in a way that could erect a stable governmental system, even if we're somehow to overcome neoliberalism? I don't really give a shit too much about what Zizek worries about or stuff like that. He's interesting to read once in a while, but he's one of those people that I read quite a bit of in graduate school, and I think that he's an academic celebrity. And why should we care any more about what Zizek has to say than about what other people who are studying the problem have to say? I think the capacity for the left, particularly in America, to organize well and to not get drawn off into all sorts of piddly bullshit issues that do matter but are not centrally important, and to allow themselves to be marginalized in that way, and then not show solidarity with each other too. There's another big problem on the left, lack of solidarity. I think these are real issues, and you don't have to go to Zizek to worry about that. I think we've got plenty of ways to theorize about that. I remember when I was at European graduate school, where, by the way, Zizek every once in a while teaches. I was there as a visiting scholar because my wife was studying there, and they had Hart and Negri, and one of them had to stay at the base of the mountain, and then the other one was up there. And it was Hart, and he was talking about Occupy Wall Street and how great it is to have not leadership and stuff like that. And I was thinking about this, and I was like, well, how the hell does that help anything? You have to have leadership. You have to have cadres. You have to have organization in order to like get things done, let alone to like reach out to other people. If you're like, yeah, man, we're a leaderless movement, well then when you're trying to do actual politics, who talks to you then? How do you work with other people who don't see things your way? Right? You have to have some sort of leadership or something, and so there's a significant problem there. Glam Pantera, are you afraid the precedent of doubt and conspiracy Trump has created by his denial of the vote will bring about problems in the future? I wouldn't say afraid, but I would say that it's guaranteed. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that we're going to have problems in the midterms. And I think we're having problems even with the, I mean, you can see this with the Georgia Senate runoffs, right? Where the Republicans are now kind of eating their own. If you're not extreme enough for them, then you've abandoned the cause, you know? And, you know, I'll admit, there's a bit of Schadenfreude that I take in watching that, because I'm like, well, you conspiracy theory bullshitters really do deserve to eat your own. But it on the other hand, I look at it as a more rational person. I'm like, this is bad. This is setting a really bad precedent. And I think it's going to lead to a lot of, like, you know, people exploiting that situation. I think it's going to lead to more violence. I think it's going to lead to hardening of positions. I think if Trump cared at all about the common good, once he saw that he'd lost, he would have, like, done what every other president basically before him has done, and said, you know, and called up and said, okay, I concede. And I think the fact that he didn't do that is a sign of terrible character and selfishness on his part. But I think he also has lots and lots of people, unfortunately, of terrible character or really damaged character who think that's cool, you know, and that he should keep doing it. And what are we going to do with all these people? That's a significant issue. Again, it's not like I'm going to do anything with them because I'm not in charge. Right? So, all right, Vale. How do I think we should approach conspiracists to maintain stable democracy? There are way too many people who either think the virus is a hoax, election is a fraud. I mean, if it was up to me, I'd be perfectly willing to use force to crack down on people who want to break the law. If you have a mask mandate and people violate it, then you know, fine them, jail them, all that sort of stuff. And if the cops don't want to enforce it, get new cops, fire them, get rid of the bad apples who think the thin blue line is the way to go. As a matter of fact, I think we really across the board, we should be doing a lot of firing and rehiring, not rehiring, a lot of firing and new hiring of police officers. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. But that's what I would do if I was in charge. There used to be this radio. He's still on John something in Chicago. I used to listen to this radio station. He used to be on WGN. I'm not sure where he is now, but he would say, if I was king for a day, and you know, then he would enact these pronouncements, right, that he would do. If you were to leave it up to me, I would say, this has now reached the point where conspiracy theories are actually a threat to public health and law and order and a lot of other things that we value. And so, tough shit for conspiracy theorists, you know. Freedom of speech is not something that we should allow to be, what do we want to say, co-opted by conspiracy theories. But I don't see that anybody's going to do much about that. Neo asks, what do I think of the implications of a potential or actual contesting of the certification of the electoral votes? I mean, we've had the last month and a half has been that, right? I mean, here's the implications. Anything in this long decades, long breakdown of the capacity to work with each other that both political parties have had, anything that one group starts to do as precedent, the other group can, like, do it after them. And they'll bitch and whine about it, but they don't really have any grounds for doing it. I mean, we are in a much worse position politically in the possibility of attaining consensus on important things and enacting legislation that we need than we were 20 or 40 years ago. And it's because of irresponsible actions, like, you know, all these lawsuits and contesting things. It is just, selfish, foolish behavior. Then again, you know, there's no guarantee that America is going to, like, remain a viable democracy, right? So, yeah. Proham says, as a progressive, do you think the moderate Dems like Nancy Pelosi Biden need criticism, or are they doing their best in a broken system? are radical policies necessary even if they're unrealistic? I'm not a progressive to begin with. You know? I'm an independent, and I'm pretty cynical about politics in general. If you've followed me for a long time, you know that I was a severe critic of the Obama administration on a number of different points. And sometimes it's progressive, and sometimes it's because I'm too traditional to be a conservative, or what passes for conservatives these days. So I do think that there are some big picture things that we absolutely need to have, and they look like progressive policies, like we need some sort of revamped nationwide healthcare system. That's just a given. Neither side really seems to want to do it. The Republicans are against it for all sorts of stupid bullshit reasons, including claims about you're not going to be able to choose your doctor. And a lot of it is just, the wish to be assholes on their part. Like, I don't want other people getting health care, and just a lack of priorities. I mean, we blow so much on national defense. We could carve out a little bit of that and solve so many problems. And then on the Democrat side, so many of them are beholden to the system the way it is, and they don't suffer from the effects of it. I mean, if you've been on the Affordable Care Act, which we are, my wife and I, as self-employed people, it is not like a handout. It's not easy to use. It's expensive. It requires a lot of work, a lot of hours, like filling out forms, and sometimes things still don't get covered. And that's the best thing that the Democrats produced, and that's the amount. That's what the Republicans were willing to go along with. We need some serious healthcare stuff. Otherwise, the next pandemic is going to kill us. If we don't fix things. If you want to call that progressive, we can call that progressive. And I think that, we criticize the Democratic leadership for falling down on the job and being beholden to the insurance companies. And, we can say the same thing with defense. Why do we see all these defense lobbyists getting brought into the once again, I was almost going to say Obama administration, into the Biden administration? I mean, and anything that we criticize the Biden administration for, we don't let the Republicans off the hook either. We say you people are like really degenerate and doing some terrible things, and you need to get your house in order. Great example of this, Ron Johnson, our senator here in Wisconsin. I don't care who they put up against him. I'll be voting against him in 2022. And you may have seen my hashtags, vote Ron out 2022. I'll be doing that. At the same time, I'll also be, calling his office and saying, hey, you guys are screwing up. You need to change your position. We need to think about things in a not necessarily having like one single solution. Politics is all about this like multi-approach, grinding away. It's like a war of attrition, but a war of attrition that can be done, for human interests, the interests of people who need a functioning political system and economic system and all these things, or for private interests, All right. Alex asks, what do you think of the ruling class divide between factions of long-term stability between short-term profit, new and old money? I think that's pretty much irrelevant at this time. I think, old money is also interested in short-term profit, and how the working class can exploit this for benefit. I don't think the working class can exploit that for benefit. I don't know that mode of analysis is really going to be that helpful. What I can say is that we live in a system where capitalism is not what it was described as in the past. There's a lot of different capitalisms, and the fact that we live in a system where, for example, we'll go back to healthcare, right? One reason why the healthcare system is as screwed up as it is not just because of the insurance companies, which are problematic, in all sorts of different ways, and which have all sorts of hooks into lobbying and all that. It's also because hospitals and hospital groups are allowed to be owned by private equity firms. We've had all this deregulation that has allowed some really crazy stuff to be going on. And is there really an old money, new money distinction to be made there? I don't think so. I don't think that's necessarily the mode of analysis, but I could be wrong. This is not like my super area of research and qualification. I'm kind of going off the cuff here. All right. Let's see here. Fado says, do I believe that we could actually overcome the hegemonic influences of media, specifically right-wing, that thrives on spreading paranoia and appeals to people's worst instincts? So overcome, here's the key term. What do we mean? Can any individual overcome it in the sense of like finding alternate media sources? Yeah. Can we overcome it in the sense of like totally discrediting them and forcing them into the margins so that they're basically in the position of like the John Birch Society? They're for clear nutters who, you know, believe in their stuff, you know, the way it was in the 60s and 70s with the radical fringe in the right. Probably not. I don't think there. I mean, I think again, war of attrition, grinding away. Right? You're not going to write an article that will take Fox News down. You know? That's just not going to happen. So you have to think about what you're going to do in a world where all sorts of people buy into this stuff, or stuff that thinks that Fox News is too, you know, milksop for them, and they want the real conservative, the real right stuff. You know, you notice that Trump himself turned against Fox News towards the end of his regime. So no, I don't think you can overcome it in the sense of like winning a war against it. But I think what you do is you try to, like, again, you know, do things on the local level, you know, make sure news stories actually get out there and get traction. And, you know, I don't think that everybody who voted for Trump is, you know, sort of irredeemable. You can reach some of them and wean them away from it, but you have to keep lines of communication open and be very realistic about what you could possibly accomplish, you know? So I don't know. I mean, the paranoia, worst instinct stuff, that's always been there. I mean, we see these moral panics and things like that going on years and years and years into the past, and you can look at propaganda against particular groups in American media stuff for, you know, going back to two centuries, really. But it is really a problem. You know, it's so damaging to the people who buy into it. It's damaging to their own capacity to operate as a rational human being. It's damaging to their own relationships. It's damaging to their own development. Sometimes you can get people weaned away from that by getting them to see it, but it's like dealing with a drug addict, you know, in many respects, I think. So, all right. Well, that's kind of dark. Let's see here. R.T. Whitby asks, is pro-racist causality in Stoic and Aristotelian texts? Oh, you heard about the paper I'm working on. Rishi says, many Democrats said they lost votes due to defund the police slogan. Do you buy this, and how does the Democratic Party navigate being the party associated with polarizing activists? Well, I mean, both parties are associated with polarizing activists. There's a lot of polarizing activists on the right, aren't there? Including some of those assholes who like went into for example, the Michigan legislature armed to the teeth. Those are polarizing activists, I think. So I don't think the polarizing activist thing, I think that's kind of a red herring. Defund the police. So did they lose votes because of that? Yes. Did they also gain votes because of that? Yes. Who knows what the margins are? Everybody's just guessing at that. So I think the narratives that say, "Oh, we lost this seat because of that," I think those are just bullshit reconstructions after the fact. I don't think there's any real evidence to support those claims. So I wouldn't take those claims seriously. That said, defund the police, I don't think is a particularly good slogan, because when you ask people about it, you get one of two answers. So from the people who are against it, and from some of the people who are for it, but for the wrong reasons. They're like, yeah, that means get rid of police altogether. And then you're like, well, okay, we need police. What are we going to do in lieu of them? And so that's the wrong answer. But a lot of people read it that way, and I think you can say, oh, they should know better. Well, why should they know better? You know, the other people who are for the slogan will say, what we mean by defund the police is we want to tie the money that the police get to like performance objectives and to things like having their body cams on and disciplining bad police and getting rid of all the proverbial bad apples and stuff like that. And then you could say, well, what you really mean is reform the police, and that's a great slogan. The police do need to be reformed. That's clear. I mean, this summer has shown us that so many police departments are way out of control, that they can't police themselves, that the bad apples thing, the bad apples have spoiled the barrel in many departments. We really do need to have police reform. And any good police officer would be for police reform and would be unpopular as a result. That's just a given, if you look at what's been going on across the board, through the protests and stuff like that. And there's all sorts of other problems with police too, things that need to be reformed. I've talked about this a lot before, so I don't have to go into great detail about it. So if your goal is really to reform the police, then that should be the slogan instead of defund the police. I don't know what mileage, other than emotional, people are getting out of like demanding that we use this slogan instead of that slogan. So I guess I'm not as cynical as Obama, who seems to be, very against the slogan on that. But I don't see it as one that's likely to have any real value going forward. So, all right. Milo says, I agree, the Biden team does seem very idealistic. They're idealistic in the respect of thinking that you can like try to reach out across the board and maybe not get your hand slapped back. They're not idealistic in the sense of like saying that, yeah, we need a really new energy policy. We need to get national health care. We need to do something about the environment. They're not idealistic at all in that. They're sort of business as usual. So idealistic is a relative term, right? Resno says, I'm seeing a contingency of conservatives turning on our uber conservative governor in Georgia. Do you think the Republican Party would have some sort of break, turning on him for not playing into Trump's fraud narrative, I should say? I would love to see both the Republican and the Democrat Party break up into sub-parties. That would be so awesome. It's not going to happen. I mean, the closest that we had to it was the Tea Party, and that Tea Party effectively took over the Republican Party, sort of like a cancer metastasizing from the inside. And that's part of how we got to Trump and where we are today. I mean, it would be, what we're going to see is Republicans turning on Republicans, but they're all still going to stay within the same party. And I don't think there's really any alternative to the Democratic Party either. We're stuck in a two-party politics, winner takes all kind of system, and I don't see any way around that, which for me, as somebody who's not happy with either party, but currently is much more against the Republicans than the Democrats, it's kind of a dismal thing, right? What are you going to do? And I'm not going to go to one of the third parties because none of them, seem viable at all. So yeah. Sean Hamill, how seriously should we take terror threats made on pro-Trump forums? Is it just bluster? Is this a threat to life in the Republic? I'd say we should take them seriously. I mean, people mean what they say, and they might not have the guts to follow through on evil plans. Threatening to kill people is pretty, that's threatening an evil act. I think that when people post stuff like that, we should find ways to do something about it. I mean, when it's happening in social media, all you basically have is like, you can report it to the cops, and then if the cops care, which, who knows, depends on your local PD, doesn't it? They might do something about it, or you can report it within the social media platform. I report tweets. I don't do much with Facebook because Facebook, I don't even like read my Facebook friends stuff anymore. I just have my page. And YouTube, not much you can do really in YouTube. I just delete the crazy stuff and ban them from my page so I don't have to deal with them, or my YouTube channel. They can go somewhere else. But we probably should have some takedowns. Getting the social media companies to cooperate, that's tough, right? And they're very deferential to high profile accounts. I mean, think about Trump and his being able to use Twitter basically as a propaganda machine this entire time. He should have been banned from Twitter years ago, including for making threats, right? Or inciting violence, like liberate Michigan. That should have been the end of his Twitter thing altogether, but it isn't. So, all right. Andrew asks, any thoughts on Christopher Lasch and his ideas on the normalization of narcissism being the major drive in American culture over the past century? I haven't read Lasch for years and years and years, so I don't remember the argument, but I don't think that is like the main thing to be concerned about. I think that was his shtick, but I don't. I mean, there's a lot of narcissism going around on both left and right, and plenty in the center. A lot of that goes just under the guise of consumerism, or the identity politics of the left and the identity politics of the right. I mean, anybody who's like, remember the good old days when white people were in charge? That's identity politics, just as much as anything anybody's doing on the left. And a lot of that is rooted in narcissism, but I don't think that saying that particularly helps us understand what's going on. Morgan says, you said in another stream you're not a leftist, but you want the left to push a lot more left-leaning policies. How do you distinguish yourself from the left? I said, I'm not a leftist. I don't have a leftist program. Anybody, I mean, if you want to call me a leftist, go ahead, and I'll tell you I'm not. That's about as easy as you can get. I'm a pragmatist when it comes to this stuff. Some of the things the left are pushing for are things we need, and we should push. And who's going to push for them? Is the right going to push for them? I mean, some people have made these arguments like if Trump had wanted to stay in power forever, he could have not screwed up the COVID response, not bought into all sorts of goofy, QAnon bullshit. He could have condemned white power stuff and actually let the FBI go after these groups, and he probably would have. He would have taken the wind out of a lot of sails. He can't do it because he's an asshole. And I mean, talk about a malignant narcissist who really just represents some of the worst stuff about America: corruption, terrible business person because he leaves people in the lurch. He couldn't do it because of his character, right? And people on the right can't push for the sort of things that they should be pushing for, like protecting the environment, or they give a lot of talk to like, finance capital and blah, 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 blah. But they don't really care about the average person, these politicians of the right. They're not helping ordinary people. So if the left is the ones who are going to do it, then I'll line up with them. I mean, at other points I said, you know what I am? I'm a virtue ethicist. So that means I'm going to work with whoever is actually putting stuff forward for the common good. If it's going to be the left, well, then I guess I have to work with the left, right? So if you think that's leftist, I guess you can think that way, but it's kind of silly. All right, let's see here. Mother says, seriously, I'm working through PTSD relating to domestic violence. As far as optimistic entries into tenuous family relations, I suggest looking at nonviolent communication, not an endorsement. Yeah, there's a lot of people working through PTSD. I think there's all these things that have been really inducing it, and not everybody. I mean, if here's something I'll say: if you have a family that imposes like really unfair and unreasonable demands on you, it's okay to cut them off. It's also okay to say like, not going to deal with you for a year or two until I feel more strong about where I'm coming from. Maybe I won't deal with you ever. That's okay, I think. You know. Colamus, do you think Machiavelli still has sway or is importance overstated? I mean, there was a period where it was very popular for business people to read Machiavelli's The Prince. And it was also very popular at the same time for them to read Sun Tzu's Art of War. I don't think they usually understood either one very well. Machiavelli, when you read The Prince carefully, you notice that he says, you know, the ordinary people, they're kind of screw ups, but the rich, you really got to watch those assholes because they are complete bastards who love to humiliate and lord it over the weak. The prince had better break or harness the rich, the powerful, right? I think he's right about that. You know? And I think rich people like just read whatever they wanted to. They basically read, hey, we should be ruthless and mean and better to be feared than loved. And that was about as far as it went. You know, Machiavelli is the prince. That's only, by the way, only a portion of Machiavelli. There's also the discourses on Livy where he's much more bullish on, you know, the people and democracy and things like that. I mean, Machiavelli's worth reading, just like Hobbes is worth reading, you know, or Aristotle's worth reading. But I don't think he's like got the keys to anything. Steve, have any critiques of Chomsky's political ideas? I think I read somewhere you're not a big fan. I'm not a fan of Chomsky. But do I have any critiques of his political ideas? No, I don't have anything well worked out like that. Milo, do you have a favorite political theorist? I mean, if there is a favorite political theorist of mine, it's probably Aristotle. You know, I keep going back to him over and over and over again. And his political ideas, by the way, are found not just in his politics, but also in the rhetoric and also in the two ethics and also in other places as well. You know, little bits and pieces here and there. But I don't have a single person who I may like Aristotelian or Hobbesian or Nietzschean or something like that. And I really do appreciate people who are within that tradition and then come out and have something new to say, you know, because there's a lot of things where Aristotle's just not, you know, adaptable to modern systems. So, you know, Alistair McIntyre is a great example of somebody who is rethinking Aristotle in the present, as is, you know, some of these people I mentioned before, like Giselle Stryker, Leslie Cosman. You know, there's a lot of good work out there, but I don't. And again, Hannah Arendt is a reinterpreter of Aristotle as well. I don't think that there's a single person that I could say that I, you know, I'm not a Rawlsian or a Habermasian or anything like that. Giovanni asked, do you see Senators Rubio and Hawley as seriously rethinking conservatives' commitment to markets? If they are serious, would a conservative commit to public programs help in our country in the long run? There's nothing that I see about Rubio, and I actually, you know, I interact with him sometimes on Twitter. Of course, I don't get any response, but and it's mostly poking at him after he says something stupid and hypocritical. I don't see anything in Rubio that makes me think that there's anything really going on there, any more than there was with Paul Ryan, when Ryan was supposedly having this shift away from Rand to St. Thomas. It all turned out to be bullshit that disappeared in the end. Rubio is somebody who, you know, if he actually took the biblical quotes seriously that he's like peppering his Twitter stream with, he would resign, or he'd be going after his own party. It's sort of like the question of the cops, right? Are there really people who are throwing the bad apples out? No, not really. And so if Rubio's criticizing markets, I mean, that's not going to last, unfortunately. All right, D says, who are the best anarchist political philosophers to read? I don't know. Not really up on anarchism, you know. It's not something I really take all that seriously, quite frankly, because I'm interested in how people do exercise power and rule, and I've never really been attracted to anarchism. Deprogrammer, a lot of people I meet do not seem to be able to engage with philosophy. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people can't engage with actual history either. They love shit that they see on the History Channel, or military history, and they're like history buffs is how they describe themselves. Just like all those people who are like political, political junkies. Anytime somebody describes himself that way, you're like, yeah, you don't know a damn thing about politics, and you only follow the little things that you're paying attention to. I think that's the case with most of the humanities. And I think that's the case with most of the sciences. Doesn't mean that they're constitutionally incapable of appreciating or understanding philosophy. It just means that where they are in their life, that's not going to happen. So, what do? We can like curse the darkness, or we can light a candle, right? We can say maybe we can reach them with a bit of philosophy. So like what we do with Milwaukee Sophia, that's a Society of Philosophers in America. We have little meetings and introduce people to ideas, and we do so with kind of baby steps. We don't go into like, now I'm going to give you, a presentation on the political architectonic, or the passional architectonic of stasis in Aristotle's Politics Book 5, something I've written out in the past, right? But I can talk about what anger looks like for Aristotle, and how understanding grievance could help us to master a bit of anger with ordinary people. And that's doing philosophy, right? Sometimes I do philosophy and I don't tell people where it's coming from. Like when I work with business people, it's a turnoff for them to find out that the ideas are actually coming from the Stoics or Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or, Mary Wollstonecraft. If they ask me afterwards, that I say, yeah, here's the book you could read about that. But otherwise, I present them with the ideas. And I think that's if we want people to like the discipline of philosophy, we got to find ways to hook them. It's interesting. Some of my colleagues today, I find this out from my students. Some of my colleagues today will when they're teaching an intro to philosophy class to non-majors in college, they'll say like, if you're not understanding these texts, there's something wrong with you as a person. And you're like, wow, you've been teaching this for 20 years. Has that ever produced useful effects for you in the classroom, or are you just indulging yourself in being kind of a standoffish disciplinarian? I take students that I get, and I try to get them to be interested in the ideas, and I show them where to go after we're done with the class to continue that. And that's about as much as we can do, I think. All right. I just skipped a bit. Let me jump back up because there was a question there about Carl Schmitt. Scrolling. Where is it? I think it was about Agamben as well. Here we go. From Kumar. How relevant do you think Carl Schmitt and Agamben to the post 9/11 era? Do you see any continuity from Foucauldian analysis of power? Okay, so there's a couple questions there, right? Let's say this. Carl Schmitt, like Hobbes, is relevant to the degree that they can provide interesting analyses of why we're where we are. We definitely don't want to follow down their rabbit holes, and we want to avoid having to need people like Carl Schmitt or Hobbes. Agamben is interesting. He's not somebody I've read an awful lot of. I think some of his ideas are useful. Seems clear that his understanding of the COVID crisis was way off base. Do I see any continuity from Foucauldian analysis of power? I mean, Agamben positions himself that way. There couldn't be any from Carl Schmitt, right? Because Carl Schmitt is prior to Foucault. And it depends on what you mean by Foucauldian analyses of power. Foucault himself is kind of all over the map, depending on what book you're looking at, right? Isn't it? And then there's various ways of interpreting Foucault in philosophy and sociology, criminology. So it's not as if there's a Foucauldian analysis of power. So I don't know. I guess I have to punt on that one. All right. Let's see. Dedicated Boy, what do you think of Julius Evola? I don't think much. I haven't really read any Evola. I've just read glosses, but it seems like everybody that I run into who's interested in Evola winds up being a right-wing nut. So that might mean something. I don't know. Raheem, is Eastern philosophy, where it just skipped, inferior to more popular Western ones? I'd get rid of the category Eastern and Western to begin with. Indian philosophy is as big of a cultural sphere as is Chinese philosophy, as is Western philosophy, as is what went on in the Islamic world, as is various indigenous things. There is no like East-West thing. That's the first thing to get over. And when you look at European philosophy, you notice that there's a lot of interactions at certain times with things that are coming from other places. Inferior, no. And I mean, how would you got like one set of people on one side of the scale and one side on the other? It's not a way to do things. I think you could say, is this particular philosopher better or this particular philosopher worse? Or is this movement or tradition better or worse, right? That's possible. I like looking at where they come together. Like what happened when the Jesuits went to China and had to rethink things in the face of this, at that point, millennia old civilization and its conceptions of things. I don't find these big picture contrasts all that useful. All right. Windows smashing job creators. What do I think about direct democracy? Pretty hard to pull off. It's tough to even do within organizations, let alone within communities. It's been done in some places, but it's always on a small scale. When we try to do it, like with state referendums, because of our political system and how much money flows into it, it's tough to say that it really does represent the will of the people and not just who's better able to advertise. But I guess it could be done. I mean, yeah. All right, Alex, what do you think of Hannah Arendt being linked to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a CIA-funded institution? Does this compromise her ideas? No, it doesn't compromise her ideas. I mean, everybody's connected to something. Dig deep enough and you can probably find. I mean, Plato said this, right? Justice in this world is never the form of justice. All you got to do is turn it a little bit on its side and you can see some injustice in the justice. It would invalidate her ideas if it turned out that like they were feeding her ideas, but did the Congress for Cultural Freedom underwrite her work on totalitarianism? If not, probably doesn't have anything to do with that part, right? So no, I don't really care, quite frankly. CIA funded a whole bunch of people's things, all right. Milo says, how important are culture war issues in your view? Well, they're absolutely important. I mean, think about the abortion issue and how that suckered in so many evangelicals and Catholics into the Republican fold and effectively led them away from Christianity in any real sense and into the weird parody of it that we see in conservative Catholic and evangelical churches today and in their discourses. I got to witness that firsthand because I was in those circles. And you'd see these people and they'd be like, the abortion issue has to trump all the other issues. We don't like the Republicans on the economy and on, use of force and stuff like that, but we got to go with them on this. And then after a while, they're like, well, maybe they're actually not that bad on like use of force, and maybe they're pretty good on the economy. And pretty soon you see people saying things that go directly against what you thought they used to stand for. And now, is there anything like that on the left where people got suckered in like that? I mean, pro-choice Catholics maybe in some respect, right? And that's just one. I mean, you could take all sorts of. I would say that the COVID, whether you wear a mask or not, is a culture war issue, and it shouldn't be, right? We should all be. Whether we think that there's anything to the mask or not, we shouldn't be indulging in like, well, it's going to choke you, or all this silly bullshit that people put out there, maybe believe in, or maybe they don't. It shouldn't have become a cultural war issue, but it did become that because there's so many things for us that are part of the cultural war. All right. Pro-M, on your story about Occupy Wall Street, is it possible to have groups and organizations without leaders? You can just elect representatives, organizers for the role of talking to others. Okay, and you're going to make a distinction between representatives and organizers and leaders then, right? Because how is the process going to work of getting the message to them, and what degree of discretion do they have in dealing with others, right? At a certain point, they become leaders, or they remain ineffective. I don't think you're going to get around leaders. You're going to need leadership, and then you got to watch out for Robert Mickle's iron law of oligarchy, right? Which I actually wrote about that in response. You can find it in Orexis de Noetique. I wrote about that in response to Hart's thing years and years ago. This would be like maybe 2014 or so. All right. Wolfwood, I don't know if you addressed this issue earlier, but is Trump's denial of the election outcome some sort of innate psychological trait, or is it nothing more than a grift to get money and attention? I think it's both. I think you've got like a perfect storm there. You've got a guy who throughout his entire life has been screwing people over and delighting in it, for years and years and years, positioning himself as being this great business leader when really he just leaves a wake of bankruptcy and creditors behind him, right? Usually unpaid. So he's been a negative effect economically in many respects, and that's because of his character and the way he likes to be. Add to it the fact that he likely is going to face all sorts of charges once he's out of office. So he's got the like save my skin imperative, and he will sell out anybody on the way and demand loyalty, as we've seen on the way. And add to it the fact that he can't resist a grift. He seems constitutionally incapable of not taking advantage of anything that he thinks is a potential deal. So the other thing to add in there too is Trump is somebody clearly who believes that it doesn't matter whether anything's true or false. It's just what you can get people to believe. And so if you can use the legal system to try to, sow doubt and all that, then he'll do that. So I think the other factor is, of course, his supporters and enablers. And I think none of them should ever be let off the hook for anything, quite frankly, given the amount of damage that they have done to our body politic and our nation. You could ask, what's their point? The ones who are the more rational, they've already jumped ship. They've been like, this guy's a loser. I better get the hell out of here. And some of them have, positioned themselves as, oh, I was like trying to fix it from within. None of them should really be believed. They all failed to stand up for what was right when they could have. Kelly's a great example. Yeah, there's like I said, it's kind of a perfect storm thing. All right, let's see what else we got here. Milo was a dark one. In a healthcare rationing scenario, do you think anti-vaxxers should be refused a respirator? I don't think anybody should be refused a respirator if we have enough respirators to go around. I'm attracted to the idea because I do think that we do need to have some sort of justice for willfully taking stupid self-indulgent stances. I would say not just anti-vaxxers, but also the anti-mask people. But how are you going to do that practically? I don't think it's attractive as an idea. I don't think it could be done in any sort of way that would be effective or fair. So, we probably shouldn't try to do that. Alex, I'm dying to know what this guy thinks about Jacques Maritain's Politics in Person. Haven't read Politics in Person. Read a lot of other Maritain stuff from earlier. And Maritain was, by the way, kind of a bad guy for a while. He was a member of Action Française, the fascist, proto-fascist, integral nationalist organization, until it got condemned by the Vatican in 26. And Maritain went through some changes and iterations of his doctrine, but he could be kind of a prick at times. Not as big of a prick as Garrigou-Lagrange, who would criticize people without admittedly being able to understand their work. But I'm not a big fan of Maritain, quite frankly. All right, rolled on. My thoughts on personalism as a political alternative to modern individualism, collectivism. I think that's probably a non-starter. Personalism names a whole bunch of approaches in philosophy. Whose personalism are you talking about? Shaler, von Hildenbrand, Martin Luther King? And what are you identifying as individualism, collectivism? It's going to be some crazy abstraction that doesn't map on all that well to whatever we've got going on. I don't think these categories are particularly helpful. All right. Shiny Pop-Tart. Should we entertain questions regarding election fraud? What do we do with various evidence that has arisen? Okay, so this is a good question. We entertain the question so long as it's reasonable to do so. We've passed the point of reasonability a long time ago. You're always in an election with a country of hundreds of millions of people. You're going to find some instances of fraud, right? You'll find that even in a local thing. The question is how much, and did it do anything? And so at a certain point, the people who are, if they were patriots, if they cared about a common good, at a certain point, the people who were talking about, oh, there could be some fraud, need to sit down and shut the hell up, if they care. Otherwise, they're just in it to try to stir shit up, and we've long passed that point. I mean, case after case after case after case. Some of the recounting happened just a block from here, and I got to see the nut jobs, and you could tell by the wild look in their eyes, these Republican observers going in and the crazy makeup and all that sort of crap. It's done. The Republicans need to accept that and then move on. And if they don't, then they're just playing politics, right? And it's the same way for the culture. All right. Deprogrammer, good thing we have democracy so that this guy can't pack the cops. Yeah, you're so clever. Glad you're here. What a dumb thing to say. All right, Sean Hamill, are comparisons with the Roman Republic helpful or unhelpful? Pretty much unhelpful. The difference between our circumstances and that of ancient Rome are so vast, it's not really helpful. We need to look for nearer things. For years and years and years, I have been saying that if we want to find closer parallels, you really want to read William Shire's The Fall of the French Third Republic, because a lot of the things that, France, people have this very distorted view about recent European history, because the French fell apart so quickly with the Nazi blitzkrieg. They forget that France was dominant militarily after World War I, despite having lost an entire generation of young men, and that if they'd wanted to, they could have nipped Germany in the bud at many different points. They actually had Germany encircled with military alliances, which then they didn't follow through on. And what killed them? Two things. One was the generals being unwilling to risk things, but also political discord. Political discord run by parties, both on left and right, who thought that they knew best and that they should undermine things. By the way, you remember me mentioning Action Française? They played a role in that. So I would look at not Rome, but the French Third Republic. All right. Let's see here. Kirby, do you think conspiracy theories should be a serious subject of attention in epistemology? They already are. There's people that have been researching this for decades. As a matter of fact, even in critical thinking textbooks, I'm pointing over there because that's where my old ones were from Fayetteville State. That was a thing that we would discuss in critical thinking classes. So, all right. Let's see here. A lot of off-topic stuff about different things. Here we go. Michael Frank, earlier you mentioned you didn't think the federal system was working. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that? In what ways isn't it working? I didn't say the federal system per se wasn't working. What I said was that it hadn't done stuff in terms of COVID, if I remember right. It could have been working, but it didn't because we had the wrong person in there. All right, let me take a question by Faramak that's off base. Aristotle in his Politics deemed slavery as ideal and practical, and his teacher to Alexander, whose adventurism in Persia ended up being short-lived. Totally wrong. If you actually read Aristotle instead of glosses on Aristotle, you will see that he actually says that most slaves shouldn't be slaves. There are some people that he says would be natural slaves, and they would only be natural slaves if they are benefited by being slaves and they have a superior master. Does Aristotle think that most Greeks are superior masters? Read the Nicomachean Ethics, read the Politics, see what he says about things. This is like totally off base. And as a matter of fact, Aristotle criticized Alexander for his treatment of barbarians and his attempt to have an oikomenike with blending Greek and Persian cultures. So, I don't know where you got your ideas, but you probably want to actually read the Aristotle. All right. Johnny Bowie asks, we need an AI-run healthcare system. That sounds terrible. I know a lot of ways you could make it worse, and that's probably got to be up in the top 5. I don't imagine, given all the problems with AI already, that an AI-run healthcare system is going to be particularly good. Ken says what the U.S. really needs is National Health Service. The concept has its faults, but healthcare is free at the point of consumption, takes away 95% of the concerns of illnesses. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to have a perfect system. You just have to have a system that is better than what we've got in place right now, which is a non-system. It's a whole set of screwed up, not well-functioning interlocking systems. We don't really have a system. So, yeah. All right, Shiny Pop-Tart. Does Socrates' criticism of democracy have relevance to the current political situation in America? Thinking specifically of the Biden-Harris administration's emphasis on democratic rhetoric. I would say not much relevance at all. You're talking about what's in there in Republic Book 8. That's a very different kind of democracy than what we have at present, or what we think of as democracy. I guess you could say the closest thing that comes to it is the notion of the democratic regime being a poikile, or we could say multifarious regime where people are allowed to do what they want. But that's not particularly Biden. I mean, that could just, the Republicans just as much want to, they talk about freedom. I want to be able to go to the barber shop and stuff like that. That's just as much in that what Socrates would be talking about, this sort of like unbridled freedom that doesn't care about the effects on other people. So I don't see it as particularly relevant. I would say other theorists would be more relevant. Let's see. John, okay, I'm going to see if I can take some people that haven't already been here. Immortals Proud, what do you think about the idea we live in a post-truth era based on the idea that social media gives people what they want to hear and confirmation bias is more present than ever? I don't know if confirmation bias is more present than ever. I would say the modes of it are different, right? And do we live in a post-truth era? It depends on, who we are and what sort of stuff we're consuming. I mean, you could say that we're forced to live in a post-truth era in that a lot of people, when you get down to it, are sort of living as if they're in a post-truth era. And then it's sort of like nothing succeeds like, success sort of thing. I know that there's plenty of us who don't view things that way, who think that truth actually still does matter. So I don't know. I'm kind of divided on that one. Okay, let's see here. There's a good point from the programmer. There's a difference between being afraid and vigilant. Let's be vigilant. I like that. Yeah, yeah. Do, 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 do. Let me skip down here a bit. So Brianna brings up a question that's sort of similar to the one I took at the start. What advice would you give to someone who's common sense progressive, but had close family who voted Trump and were his fans until the bitter end? Our household seems polarized and in need of repair. So I think that you might have to accept that your household might not get repaired. It's a live possibility that some of the people who went like all in on Trump and bought into all the this is so good and this is so good and this is so good and these are so bad sort of rhetoric, you might never see them come out of it. That's kind of it's kind of a strong possibility. So all right, let me see what else we have. Oh, here's a good one from Reservoir Duck. I don't understand how Trump's voters see Trump as an altruistic figure sacrificing himself for the common good. He seems an obvious narcissist and fraud. Any thoughts on how people reach this? Yeah, it never happens with like a switch flipping. They have to go in bit by bit by bit by bit. I mean, it's weird too to like see these things where people have memes where Trump is this muscular figure when actually he's just a huge, blob who can't even like stand like a human being. He's got such weird posture because he's got to have like elevators in his shoes to make himself look like he's a bigger guy. This is part of why it's so difficult to wean people away from this. It didn't just happen with one moment or one idea. It's all sorts of things that have consolidated something that we can call a habitus, a hexis in Greek. And this is like what Aristotle, talks about. Vices are hexes, and that doesn't just mean habit. It means like a lasting disposition that has been formed that deforms not just how you respond, but how you feel, how you interpret. As Nancy Sherman talks about this, vices and virtues change what we view as ethically salient, what we view as mattering, and how we view things. So, yeah, it's going to be weird to see people trying to get away from this once their great leader is gone. And some of them are always going to believe that he was a wonderful man, But we can see stuff like this with like if you again look at French history. There was this guy Poujade who, when Trump first came on the scene, I was like, that's Poujade again, And there are still people today who are like, oh, he was a great man, So you're never going to see that go away. Edmund Burke asks a local question. What do I think about Marquette's recent cut in faculty? I think it's totally shameful. I think that Marquette quit being a Catholic institution in any real respect at least 20 years ago. They certainly don't live up to their Catholic and Jesuit ideals. And while I was still teaching for them part-time, I saw them cut the core, where you have philosophy and theology, to the bare minimum possible. They've been selling themselves out for, professional schools, the School of Law, engineering, the big ticket stuff, business school for years. they quit being what they were decades ago. And if Marquette wanted to not cut those jobs, they easily could. They have a $700 million endowment, which they could easily tap into. They own real estate all over the Milwaukee area, which they could sell. It's a deliberate choice to cut the faculty, and to cut the faculty in certain areas, to change the nature of the school. But that's what you get when you have a board of trustees and administrators who do not care anything about Catholic education. So, all right, let's see if we can grab one more thing. And then we'll end, because I've got to get back to grading. The worst part about being a professor. Here's a good one from Ashmar. Can philosophers become more directly involved in national politics and forming policy? Lawyers and business people always run for office and get admin positions, never philosophers. Philosophers have, but it's pretty rare. And, should they get involved with national politics? How do you do that nationally if you haven't done it locally? First, you have to do local politics. And I've known people in my philosophy departments who've held political office, or who were involved at least in races, and then they lost. So I think if we're going to do that, we have to train them up, and that's going to take a lot of time. I don't think a lot of people in philosophy are particularly into doing that work, but that's yeah. I'm not going to do it. I'm busy enough with the stuff that I do. I'm willing to be involved in politics in the sense of like writing letters and calling people and things along those lines. Somebody's up on the roof hammering, but I'm not interested in running for office. But I'm willing to support other people who are, that takes a lot of time and a lot of attentiveness. So that's a good thing to end on. Thanks to all of you for joining me. I might do something later in the week, maybe like a pop-up around Christmas time for those who want to hang out for a little bit and maybe have a toast or something like that. But now it's back to grading hell. Which is going to continue most of the rest of the weekend. I might get a walk in a little bit later to clear my head, but still have a lot of final grades to do. So, all right, I'll see all of you, and take it easy.